Hello there. This is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file coming to you live from Algiers with me, Karifa Zachary. Here's what's on tap today. Ukraine accuses Russia of deliberate killings after the death of at least 15 people in the eastern part of the country after a strike that ripped open an apartment building in Chasiv-Yar. Zelensky also rebutted claims that Russia has been taking an operational pause in the last week, saying that from Ukraine's perspective, hostilities have continued as before and its forces are repelling assaults in various directions. Despite the sanctions, Russia is still conducting what it called a special military operation, with President Putin saying Russia has barely started its action and the imposed sanctions are hurting the rest of the world more than Russia itself. Russian gas supplies to Germany via the Baltic Sea pipeline Nord Stream 1 have been halted for 10 days. And Russia has already cut gas supplies to Poland, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, Denmark and Finland over their refusal to comply with a new payment scheme. More about the repercussions of the war and other pressing issues on the ground in Ukraine with our panel of guests after this break. Hello again. So as announced earlier, I am joined live via Skype by Kyle Inen, Senior Geopolitical Analyst from Turkey. Thank you, gentlemen, for agreeing to be with us, along with Mykola Volkivsky, former advisor to Chairman Committee Parliament of Ukraine. Thank you for being with us, sir. Before we delve into any discussion, let me share with you, dear guests and dear viewers, the latest on the ground. Russia missile hit an apartment building in eastern Ukraine and killed at least 15 people, according to Kiev. Let's follow this report and we get down to discussion.
Russian forces continued to shell eastern Ukraine on Sunday, killing at least 15 people in a strike that ripped open an apartment building in Chasiv-Yar, according to Ukrainian authorities. The strike occurred at night in a small town of 12,000 inhabitants. According to Kiev, 24 people are still under the rubble, including a child, while 5 others were saved. After a Russian missile hit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded, saying that all those who hit their cities with rocket fire will all be found. In his evening address, Zelensky added that Ukrainian law enforcement is doing everything necessary to record the occupiers' crimes and collect evidence.
All those who carried out these shelling and other missile strikes, all those hitting our cities with a rocket's fire, such as in the Kharkiv region in Zaporizhia, as well as in Siversk, Vohilidar, in the Donetsk region, they will all be found.
The Ukrainian leader called Russia a terrorist state and accused Russian troops of purposely targeting ordinary houses.
Russian terror has long since crossed the line beyond which it has become apparent to many in civilized world that is a matter of global security to punish Russia, a terrorist state, for all that it has against Ukraine and the international legal order.
The Russian army, which announced in early July that it had taken control of the Lugansk region, is now targeting Donetsk to occupy the entire Donbas mining basin. It has been partially controlled since 2014 by separatists backed by Moscow after the Russian annexation of the Ukrainian Crimean Peninsula.
Mr. Mykolai, let me commence with you. What could you update us on the latest development on the ground since you are in Ukraine?
A big missile attacks on Chasiv-Yar, and now from the latest information in the city in Donetsk region, it's about 20 people was killed by the Russians. All the time we are also in touch with the politicians who visited Ukraine. I mean, even the Prime Minister of Netherlands, now he make a visit, Martin Rutte, to Ukraine. He will be just around the cities around the Kiev region, and also they proceeded to attack to the Russians in the Kherson, the Mykolaiv region, and Zaporizhia. from seeing this kind of this information, we saw this attacks continued. They try to enter much more closer to this regions where it is like already occupied. I mean, the Russian side. We expected all of the emergency sirens from the last night, because a lot of part of Ukraine was on the big signals, and even we will see what was going next, because by myself, we just last week we back from the NATO summit in Madrid. It was a lot of talks, and now we see that leaders after this summit will continue to make this official visit to Ukraine to show what is going on from the ground. Yes, we receive it all the time, more and more information about the more civilians was killed by the Russians in Ukraine, and we will make those updates. I mean, like the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and Office of the President, like every 10 hours. But yes, it's a situation. It's proceeding, unfortunately.
Mr. Kyle, Moscow has made it clear that it is planning to dominate the Donetsk region, which paves the way to occupy the entire Donbas. Are the defensive weapons coming from the U.S. doing enough to stop the Russian advancement, according to you?
Sure. So let's rewind clocks back to February 24th, from when it started. Since then, $6 billion worth of equipment and security assistance to Ukraine, that being portable javelins, heavy artillery, to tactical drones, to armored vehicles, to HIMARS. HIMARS are actually the type of rocket systems, high mobility.
The connection with you, Mr. Kyle, seems to be a little of low quality. If you could just perhaps call us back. And I redirect the question to Mr. Mikula. Do you think that the supply of weapons to your country, Mr. Mikula, is enough or doing enough to halt the Russian aggression?
Our distinguished guest just mentioned it, M142 was given by Ukrainians as the HIMARS by the Americans. It's so useful weapon, and we need more and more supply from this kind of American side support. I just mentioned it earlier. We just backed on the NATO summit in Madrid, and all the declaration of which was given by the leaders of the state of NATO. Number 4 on the articles about was the proceeding of supply and proceeding to military support by the 30 NATO membership countries. And also we expected even the more supply from for example, from Caesar, from the French side, which Emmanuel Macron mentioned it during his visit in 16-17 last month. It's most useful. This kind of military supply will help Ukrainians, to find those regions which was already occupied since February 24. I mean, like the Zaporizhia region, Kherson regions, also the one of the part of Donetsk and Lugansk region. But we will see. We expected when we have the latest updates from the Lugansk. The Ukrainian authorities and Russian authorities said is under the total control of the Russians since last week. It's also been a big problem. From this reason, we expected more military support, and also this kind of military support will send it by the Ukrainians next week. Maybe we expected this month. And also this kind of support not just would need to be given from the countries like I mentioned it, from USA or UK or France. It also will be the next all NATO membership countries. Also, I try to figure out and also to say that kind of support by the private companies as Bayraktars, which was given by Ukrainians, now just delivered. Like, for example, from Lithuanian support, also from the Polish one, and we expected more and more Bayraktars, which was useful during this war from the Turkey. That's also the one which kind of military was exist in Ukraine and also helping Ukraine. Also, we just need to pay attention because the Russian all the time they use this military or weapon which was produced to 1991. I mean, like this during this post-Soviet Union era. It's now with the Americans and our allies, which was given to support us more and more modernized. From this reason, we are making a step forward from this kind of attack and defense. And also, we are paying attention about the diplomacy and how it's going on. 2 days ago, I participated biggest conference in Parliamentary Intelligence Summit in Bucharest. It was a lot of topics about how this military support will proceed to Ukraine. A lot of distinguished guests and also politicians, even Congressman Robert Pittenger or Larry Tesler, they mentioned it about this kind of support we were giving to Ukraine. And from this we need to observe how its situation will be developed in the next few weeks, even months, because all the time more and more Russian politicians or Ukrainian, they say it's kind of big issue, the big war, they proceeding, but we need to pay attention and be a warning and be waiting for this kind of support will be given into Ukraine as soon as possible.
Very nice. Mr. Kyle is back with us. Only modern and powerful weapons could actually stop Russia's attacks. Haven't the Western allies sent enough military weapons for Ukraine or military aid for Ukraine? And what kind of modern weapons is the Ukrainian president looking for? I mean, how long this will go exactly? What will the trajectory be? We don't know right now, but we know if the U.S. doesn't continue to support Ukraine, perhaps the outcome for the U.S. will be much worse. How do you see it, Mr. Kyle?
Sure. Let's look at the statistics here. So since the beginning of the unprovoked invasion on February 24th, Russia's economy has been contracting severely, and by economic forecast, Russia will be shrinking about 15% each year, and that's going to get worse. Sure, ruble seems to be standing out or regaining its power because it's hedged to gold, but it doesn't seem like it's going to hold out much longer due to Western sanctions. Now, let's clearly specify here that sanctions were put out to gradually get Russia out of plainly speaking, isolate Russia globally. But again, it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, and I think the Western allies are seeing this happening on the ground. So that's one of the important parts. But there's also another side to the system. Yes, the Western allies are actually supplying Ukraine with perhaps the most state-of-the-art technology that is available. But again, the technical usage of these artilleries, it also takes time. So it takes time to adapt. There's Cheetahs, Stinger missiles, anti-armor systems, missiles, and so many other weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine, but gradually this is going to take time to turn the tides over.
Very nice indeed. And speaking of the military aid, British-made armored vehicles FV-103 Spartan arrived on the front line in the Donbas region, where a Ukrainian tank commander from the 14th Mechanized Brigade says the Ukrainian army still needs tanks, howitzers, and lots of long-range artillery.
They have a lot of resources because this is a big country, and this country is an aggressor who is always at war, who always accumulates weapons. We can oppose them, but above all, we need machines, weapons, and motivation.
Back to you, Mr. Kyle here. Many analysts raise the concern about the fatigue factor of the public in a wide range of countries, especially in the United States, because of the economic costs and because there are other pressing concerns at home to deal with. How do you see that, and what's your prediction regarding this substantial aid that is being sent to Ukraine all the time? And of course, it is a source of complaint to many people at home.
People are definitely right to address their concerns, but there's already a shortage of supply around the world. So that needs to be factored into the grain shortages around the world. Right now, as many of us would know, there's a grain shortage in the world, and this is going to get much severe in the coming years. So this is number one issue that needs to be put on table and analyzed in detail. Russia is actually trying to use the wear and tear strategy, which it believes it's working right now. But what we've seen, or as we have recently seen in the G20, Russia is still being isolated from the international platform. So it is not the right time to make a forecast for Russia.
No, it's not about Russia, Mr. Kyle, since we're talking about the economic sanctions that are having repercussions on the Western allies themselves, and also the fatigue factor in the US and in so many Western countries where the inflation is really skyrocketing, and it's affecting the purchasing power of the average citizen there. So how do you see this affecting? I mean, just look at the collapse of government, and we have UK as an example here. I mean, the government of the United Kingdom just collapsed with Boris Johnson at the top. Do you think that these kind of supplies and the aid is going to continue?
I don't think this can last or can be sustained much longer. Here, the number one issue is fossil fuels. So the supply of oil to the EU. As you know, Nord Stream is going into maintenance starting today, so that's going to take 10 days for maintenance. But the EU is doubting that it might actually take much longer than 10 days. So if that may be the case, we might see inflation spiking again. So that is what is happening on the ground on the Western Hemisphere right now. So yes, people are very concerned that things are going to get much more expensive once winter season starts. And people are trying to address how bad inflation is getting thanks to the Russian supply, the cutting of the Russian gas. So people really need to address these issues as days go by.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Mr. Mykola Volkivsky? How sure are Ukrainians that the West are going to keep supporting them in this war, although the debt is accumulating, especially when they are sending them this military support? Of course, it's not going to be for free, Mr. Mykola Volkivsky. How do you read the situation here?
Due to the latest speech, which was given Parliamentary Intelligence Forum Assembly in Bucharest, the Ukrainian MP Liza Yaskoza said the man of idea of Putin now to make the people tired, because that's what Russia expected. On the people from the informal wage, the people gonna tired because of the war in Ukraine or because of economical sanctions. It started for me, by my observation. Even for example in Davos Forum 2 months ago in Switzerland, a lot of some businessmen or economists that tried to say let's sit in touch to make some peaceful agreements with Russia. And we know now it's impossible. From this way, it's an idea for Putin, to start to make the people tired about the war, about the Ukraine, or for example, he tried to pick up the more time, to continue his war in my country. From this reason, I'm totally agree from this. It's a kind of idea he was pursuing all the time. About the economic sanctions or about the current situation on military support, I think our allies, including UK, they will continue to give us military support. I had a little short conversation with Boris Johnson in Madrid summit. He said he's supporting Ukraine all the time, and even he make a big address to Ukrainians, to Ukrainian president from the Downing Street 10, on the day he was resigned. From this reason, we are keeping support. We will keep in support from UK as well. From other countries, some of the people, they tired about their war in country. It's less on the main TV or newspapers. They talking about the Ukraine and about the war in Ukraine, but. Hopefully, we will see which war is continued in Ukraine, defend in Ukraine, not just themselves. In Ukraine, it's European Union. But I never saw the European Union more united like this after World 24. From this reason, all of European countries around the they helping and trying to support Ukraine. I mean, even last week, it was biggest recovery conference in Lugano, Switzerland. It was for about 56 countries. I don't mention it, their weapon or supply. I mean, they buy humanitarian aid or medical support. These kind of countries will give it Ukrainian support due to declaration of Lugano in Switzerland.
But Mr. Mykola Volkivsky, this is not going to be for free, is it?
I mean, if we'll see this donation due to Lugano declaration, it will be donations from 3 of the countries which will support. I mean, for example, due to this declaration, some of the countries will keep proceeds as military or not military humanitarian support to some region which was most under attack after 24th of February, like Donetsk, the Kherson region, Mykolaiv, or something like that. It's most talk about the people, about personal donations. And also, I would like to mention
perhaps away from the personal donations, what can you say about this big, heavy artillery that is being sent to Ukraine on daily basis? And we see that it costs billions and billions of dollars. Don't you think that the West someday are going to ask for the debt to be repaid from Ukraine?
I mean, for example, I would like to talk about the Marshall Plan or Lend-Lease, which was, for example, programmed by the President Biden. It's due to this information we will receive in a more and more support. But I don't talk about how this money will back in near the future. We're just talking about how as soon as possible to have to save the lives, to save the people. After we will talk about the recovery, about the development, where this war will finish.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Kyle? In a press conference of the G20 summit meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that China should not be neutral about the war in Ukraine. He stressed that the U.S.-China relationship is beneficial to the whole world. What's your comment about this? How can we expect China, a traditional ally of Russia, to actually be on the same line with the U.S., and how can the bilateral relations between the U.S. and China benefit the whole world, according to you?
Sure. Let's start with how it benefits the global trade relations, and then we go back to the G20, if you like. So there's around $600 billion worth of trade before the pandemic began between China and the U.S., and that was actually the driving factor of the global economy and why it was in such great shape. Right now, because of the previously mentioned supply chain issues, that is not the case anymore. And Antony Blinken sat with his counterpart Wang Yi of China for about 5 hours to hammer out the details of how they're going to benefit from strategic partnership, and Secretary Blinken asked Wang Yi to break away or at least distance itself from Russia's intentions and end goals that it might hope to achieve in the coming months. So that is part of what U.S. is trying to do, and China's stance is constantly changing. But we will see if China will be the determining or more of the decisive factor here, in terms of the ongoing invasion.
Russian President Vladimir Putin warned of possible catastrophic consequences of Western sanctions for global energy market. Let's listen.
Despite the unprecedented sanctions pressure, the situation in the Russian energy sector remains quite stable. The Europeans are trying to replace Russian energy resources, but the result of such actions is quite predictable. The rise in the spot price of gas and the increase in prices for consumers and households. This demonstrates that the sanctions against Russia do more harm to the countries applying these sanctions.
Back to you, Mr. Mykola. President Putin says the continued sanctions against Russia risk triggering catastrophic energy prices rises for consumers around the world. How do you see these warnings, Mr. Mykola?
Sanctions against the Russians in the first day of 24th of February. Thanks for this, all of the European countries, including Ukrainian allies, they're putting more and more sanctions against the politicians, against their government, against Russia as at all. Even about this kind of situation, which was a big discussion during the G7 summit in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Schloss Almau in Germany. Leaders of the state was said about this, how they make proceed in this kind of sanctions against Russia. But in my opinion, by themselves, it was so useful against Russia, which was sanctions was made since of the war of the beginning. About the situation with grain problem, yes, which my distinguished guest already mentioned it. It's an idea which we need to proceed to cooperate and negotiate with President Erdogan, how to fix this kind of problems. And also with World Food Organization, Del Beasley is the head of this organization, already been in Ukraine. And also about the energy resources, and more countries would say they don't want to receive those kind of gas from the Russia. It's what was these countries was united. But actually we will not know how it will be for example, in December or January, because due to this period of the time, for example, in Ukraine, it's so a problem with the weather. It will be so cold. From this, we need to fix all of this, issue and problem with energy sector before this winter period of time. That's why one of the main issue it need to be fixed, in Ukraine, as soon as possible, because it's as soon as it's 6 months, it will be the winter period. And it's also how to proceed. But against the sanctions, of course, it's Russia still isolated from the whole around the world. I mean, around all diplomatic way, or about some negotiations with other countries. It's a way, because they was caring about the sanctions which was given by the Russians, by their allies, when the war beginning.
What about you, Mr. Kyle? European Union customers have said they want to wean themselves off Russian gas, while a group of 7 leaders said last month that they wanted to explore price caps on Russian fossil fuel, including oil. Is this considered as a backup to put in statements the world is in need of Russian gas, or are there any alternatives?
Right now, it is what needs to be done is to put a price cap on commodity prices, and that only happens once Russian gas is in full effect. Unfortunately, it is too early for the EU to fully transition into an alternatively functioning renewable energy system. It's too early. Now the ports and terminals in the EU are not capable enough to do that. But the EU is actually importing 40% of its gas, or of its, in fact, energy from Russia. Now, you're looking at, I think it was last year, there was around 155 billion cubic meters of gas imported from Russia with Nord Stream 1. And now the reason that Nord Stream 2 was built to Germany from Baltic Sea was to, in fact, increase the supply of that gas whenever there was a need or whenever there was a scarcity of energy. But now that plan has halted, and this is unfortunately impacting commodity prices all over the world. Now, one might think that is regionally impacting all those, households there, but it has effect on global prices everywhere, and that is including oil as well, not just gas.
Very nice indeed. And Mr. Mikola, recently President Vladimir Putin said that Russia has not started the serious business in Ukraine yet. He also referred to the possibility of negotiations at the same time. Is this considered a direct threat to the West? And what is President Putin referring to when he says Russia has barely started its action, according to you?
They are mentioning it all the time. The Putin try to make this kind of statements all the time to the people inside the country. It's like to make it scary in Ukraine, for example, to allies of Ukraine, to NATO leaders. Because actually, he doesn't even expect this kind of Scandinavian countries like Finland and Sweden will join NATO soon, because he was pretty sure that Erdogan will, make it neutral, because he already mentioned in this kind of Sweden, for example, they host a lot of terrorists, what he mentioned from Kurdish party. I mean, of course, these kind of statements which was Putin to give, it was the way, to manipulate or to make, to positive reaction from the informal way inside the country. But I try to remind, we tried to head the negotiations with Russia in 29th of February in Belarus. Also, it was 2 or 3 steps of the years, this negotiations with peaceful negotiations with Russia on the way, on the level of the advisors to the president or advisors or MPs. And after that, I really try to remind you that also it was negotiations with Russia twice in Istanbul and in Ankara during the diplomatic forum. I mean, of course, it's kind of diplomatic way. It's quite possible, but we need to be sure that all of these statements, all of ideas need to be written inside these documents before we started this negotiation of peaceful talks with the other sides of the Russia. But in my way, it's to make the manipulation, because if Putin said he doesn't even started this big invasion, big war, but it seems to be. But they already started in 24th of February. That's my most powerful started by the Russians.
What about you, Mr. Kyle? Do you agree with our distinguished guest that this is just propaganda talk, and Russia accuses the West of waging a proxy war at the same time against it by hammering its economy with sanctions and stepping up the supply of advanced weapons to Ukraine, which upsets Russia a lot? Yet President Putin is saying that the situation in the Russian energy sector remains quite stable, emphasizing that the sanctions harm the West more than it does with Russia. How can the sanctions fail to this point, to halt the war? And can we say it is true that the harm is more on the countries applying these sanctions?
I'll say this very clearly. It is mutually disadvantageous. It has no benefits to no sides, as you could see from the increase in commodity prices all around the world. And there's going to be shortage of supplies continuing probably in the next coming years. So Russia might purport to say, hey, I'm not done here yet, but it is trying to make a point the point that the NATO partners should stay away from Russia, but that is actually not what the West wants. So we're going to see this happening over and over until both sides come together and at least have pursue diplomatic talks. But when we look at what came out of the G20 today, we barely see that there's an effort or a conclusion to be reached here. Secretary Blinken tried to meet with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and the Foreign Minister Lavrov accused Secretary Blinken by saying, "Hey, you're too Russophobic, and we should really sit down and talk." But I think among all the countries who participated in G20, Indonesia have actually accused Russia of having such animosity towards other countries.
Mr. Mikola, as a final question, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres met with the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen this week to address current problems that threatens the world in the last decades. It was the first of its kind meeting between the officials of the EU and the UN. One of the challenges facing the multilateral order in the current international context is the war in Ukraine. So, President of the Commission Ursula von der Leyen accused Russia of damaging the international order and the global economy. How do you read it yourself?
For example, it's important that the United Nations leaders and General Secretary Ursula von der Leyen make a big summit to talk each other. But I try to remind you, during the last official visit of Antonio Guterres to Ukraine, the Russians attacked the big house in the city of center of the Kyiv. Some people was killed by this missile attack. From this reason, they tried, to show that we don't care even about the United Nations. I mean, like the Russian, because they doing the same day was his official visit in Kyiv. But as for me, it's good because it's kind of biggest organization to be our international organization, European Union, in United Nations. They make each other a big statement and declaration about the future. And also it's important even for Ukraine.
And despite the substantial support that the EU and the UN gave to Ukraine, do you think there is a further support to Ukraine, Mr. Kyle?
There could be more humanitarian assistance, but I think financial support is going to go only so far, because we're going to see backdrop or support crises as well in the coming days and months. As you previously mentioned, what happened in the UK is a precursor to what is going to happen. That might happen to follow in other EU members as well, saying, yes, we are really dire. We really want to support Ukraine, but we're doing as much as we can. So there needs to be another solution to this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kyle. We have reached the end of our special coverage. So thank you, dear guest, for your thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News with me, Karim Fazakri. Bye for now.